What can Babylon 5 teach us about the COVID-19 outbreak? Babylon 5 is a 90s sci-fi series with an episode about the outbreak of a deadly disease. It may be just a show, but art reflects life, and through that reflection we learn more about ourselves. The show is set in the future, 2259. Humans have travelled into space and discovered many alien races living among the stars. Babylon 5 is a space station that brings all the races together so they can work out their differences peacefully. In the episode Confessions and Lamentations, Season 2, a race known as the Markab begin dying from an infectious disease. Lazarin, the local Markab doctor, tries to hide the true cause of the deaths. He is found out by Franklin, the station's chief medical officer. When confronted, Lazarin admits the disease is 100% terminal and 100% contagious. After an incubation period of a few weeks, it kills within 24 hours of the first symptom. Named the Drafa Plague, his people saw it as a punishment from God. The disease was kept secret by families and governments alike to avoid scandal. This silence allowed the disease to spread to all corners of the Markab civilization. Seeking to control the outbreak, Captain Sheridan orders Babylon 5 to go into lockdown. Chaos ensues, and incidences of violence start increasing against the Markab. Lazarin gets sick and dies, but with the information from his infection, Franklin is able to find an antiviral. But it's too late. The entire Markab population perishes, with only a few pockets remaining. There are so many themes in this episode it would take hours to unpack them all. In this video I'm going to focus on the comparison between the Drafa Plague and COVID-19.
Our leaders were afraid the people would take the disease as a sign from the gods that we had fallen from grace. They were afraid they would be voted out for attacking the public good. They were afraid.
Lazarin's government ordered him to cover up the deaths of the Markab. They feared that if word got out they had let the Drafa Plague in, they would be voted out. A parallel story can be seen in China. China has a history of downplaying things that could destabilize support for the ruling party. In 2003, it impeded information on SARS. They only want good news, happiness, and unity. China actively censored news about COVID-19 when it first appeared. In one example, Dr. Li Wenliang warned his medical colleagues about COVID in an online chat. This chat was detected and censored by the Chinese government, and Dr. Li was charged with spreading rumors. Ultimately, the world lost precious time because of this kind of censorship. Tragically, a month after Dr. Li was censored, he died from the very disease he was trying to warn people about. He was 34. When art reflects the life we know, life begins to imitate art.
Why did you try to block our examination of the ship? We could have helped.
Because I was forbidden. Because we were ordered to remain silent.
Across the Pacific Ocean, Dr. Anthony Fauci was also a medical professional silenced by his own government. Dr. Fauci has been the director of the US Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases for 40 years and worked with previous presidents dating all the way back to Ronald Reagan. Concerned in mid-January this novel virus could turn into a pandemic, he was unable to convince the US president to act. Instead, he was faced with a wall of science denialism and a cruel disregard for human life. On March 14th, the president asked why the disease couldn't simply wash over the country. At first, Fauci was confused by the question, then he had to explain. Mr. President, many people would die. Yet Fauci continues to toe the party line, even apologizing if he says anything that should upset the incumbent president. Fauci understands what's at stake, looks past the politics, and works to maintain a working relationship with the president. Unfortunately, the story of Lazarin, along with Li and Fauci, brings with it another warning. Even a medical scientist with the best intention is under the whim of the incumbent political party.
Doctor, it's your jurisdiction. What's the plan?
Leaders should be like Sheridan. In fact, we should all be like Sheridan, understand our limits and listen to the science. When Franklin explained the situation, Sheridan looked lost as he began to comprehend the enormity of what could happen. He understood, however, this was something he had no expertise in, and after his staff looked to him for leadership, he deferred to Dr. Franklin and asked what the next step was. Then he acted decisively, quarantining the station straight away.
The next 24 hours are absolutely critical if we're going to control the spread of this disease.
Acting quickly and aggressively has helped many countries in containing their COVID-19 outbreaks. Vietnam borders China and has a population of 95 million, yet it only has 312 cases and no deaths. Their success may have been attributed to acting early and aggressively. They ordered the cancellation of all flights to and from Wuhan on January 24th, only one day after their first confirmed case. Within days, they established 40 emergency response teams, and they still hadn't had their third confirmed case. Vietnam's broader strategy was to start targeted testing early and develop quick and cheap tests that were manufactured in the country. Testing has been the World Health Organization's #1 strategy for dealing with COVID-19. Information is power, and when you know where the disease is, you can contain it. Back on Babylon 5, Franklin's first action was to have every single Markab tested. For Franklin, tracking the course of the disease in a patient allowed him to find an antiviral. When there is an epidemic, science has the only key to saving lives.
When everyone's looking for someone to blame.
Dr. Franklin tells the story of how cats were massacred during the Black Death. People thought the disease was brought by the devil, and since cats were the devil's familiar, they started killing off the cats, not realizing that they were the only means of controlling the real source of the infection, the rats and the fleas that came with them. There's not enough evidence to say whether this story is true or not, but myths are like that, and as a myth, it's a good parable. Outbreaks are always complicated tales of fear and hate. Chaos begins to take over. No one knows how the plague spreads or who it can infect. They can't see the enemy, so they start turning against themselves, with people acting out of fear rather than reason. Truth goes by the wayside, and people start spreading misinformation. Everyone starts blaming everyone else. In the end, the chaos only helps the disease spread faster.
And when people get scared, they start looking for scapegoats.
And there are plenty of scapegoats from both diseases. There's racism against those the disease affected first.
What did you do, huh? Why did you bring this here?
Church leaders blaming Satan.
People would take the disease as a sign from the gods that we had fallen from grace.
Conspiracy theories about who made it.
You know, I heard it was the Vorlons that poisoned that place.
The coronavirus that we're dealing with here is an offensive biological warfare weapon.
The Office of the Director of National Intelligence concurs with the wide scientific consensus that the COVID-19 virus was not man-made or genetically modified.
About who let it spread.
Implication. How do I know this isn't a conspiracy on the part of your world to destroy my people? For all I know, this disease was planted in our drinking water, our food.
Wearing the mask literally activates your own virus. You're getting sick from your own reactivated coronavirus expressions.
Even blaming COVID on modern technology. Or Dr. Fauci.
So Anthony Fauci, the man who is heading the pandemic task force, was involved in a cover-up.
And finally, the idea that the disease is a hoax.
You are spreading hysteria and fear about my people that is totally unwarranted.
What virus are they going to spread? There is no virus out there they're going to spread.
They're scaring the living hell out of people, and I see it again as like, oh, let's bludgeon Trump with this new hoax.
Big threat. We're all going to die anyway.
And in the middle is Babylon 5 / the World Health Organization trying to stick to the science and maintain order between all sides.
The focus of all political parties should be to save their people. Please don't politicize this virus. It exploits the differences you have at the national level.
The World Health Organization is stuck between an escalating game of blame between the US and China. Just like Babylon 5, the WHO has to juggle between treading politics and advocating science. The only way to solve a global pandemic is to get every country to work together. The WHO cannot afford to alienate any country, even if a government is hostile and their perspective not scientifically valid. Such countries make the WHO's job much harder, but all it can do is continue advocating the science as much as possible in such limiting circumstances, hoping that what little they can do is enough. Diseases do not care about politics and will continue to kill long after a party is voted out. Pandemics are a time when people must put aside their politics and follow the science for the good of all. Had Franklin known about the Drafa Plague when the first case hit the station, he could have helped save 1 billion Markab lives. The same goes for every country in the current pandemic. Will they allow the science to save lives, or will they let politics get in the way?
That does seem to be the rule, doesn't it?
analyze the problem, choose whichever strategy makes least sense, and then do it.
Virus denying was taking its damage. Epidemiologists began having to create models that included the people who believed the virus was a hoax. Doctors and healthcare workers started getting fed up with having to treat people who denied their illness was real. People under lockdown started arguing that since there were few deaths, the lockdown was pointless and way too harsh. This trippy circular logic ignores that it was a lockdown that reduced the number of deaths in the first place. What seems like a self-evident explanation is not so self-evident to a lot of people. Paradoxically, if lockdown worked, it appeared to public discourse that it was never needed in the first place. How does WHO deal with this kind of verbal gymnastic evasion? How would anyone deal with it? Ambassador Fashar ignores the warnings of social distancing. He gathers the Markab people together in one place, believing that because they are moral, they are immune. They believe they alone will survive the disease. By gathering his people together, however, it only helps the disease spread faster. He ends up losing his life, just as Bishop Gerald O'Glenn did in the US. Bishop Glenn purposely defied state recommendations of social distancing. He held a church service on March 22nd proclaiming that God would protect them. 3 weeks later, he died from the coronavirus. His family all tested positive. From protest rallies to churches, people across the US are gathering in large groups, denying the reality of the virus and proclaiming it a hoax. The US is not the only country with protests, though they may have the largest organised protests. Protests have occurred in many countries like Australia, France, Germany, and even China and Russia. The protests are mainly loose gatherings of people, but some protests are hijacked, guided by those with their own agendas, taking advantage of the situation to stoke pre-existing political unrest. This is yet another example of how pandemics are politicized and the science ignored.
You are to be congratulated for finding a way to stop the plague from spreading further.
Well, any thanks is more properly directed to Dr. Franklin.
In Australia, the people took the pandemic seriously, and they took lockdown seriously. They deserted the commercial centres and took their children from school, even before it was made law by the government. While other countries are still under lockdown with rising mortalities, Australia is in the middle of opening up after reaching near zero new cases each day. The Conservative Government of Australia has shared extremist anti-science ties with both the UK and the US, yet enjoys an astonishing success that gets little attention in the media. What happened? A former Conservative Prime Minister, John Howard, counselled the current Prime Minister that there's no ideological constraints at times like this. Combined with the pressure of the state premiers at a combined meeting, this slowly nudged the obstinate ideology aside. Finally, the government who had ignored and derided scientists for a decade started listening. Australia is now reaping the benefit, far ahead of most countries in the world. John Howard's practical focus was evident when he was Prime Minister as well. He was a fiercely right-wing Prime Minister who enacted strong gun control laws after the mass murder of 35 people. No mass shootings occurred for the next 20 years. Then, as now, he was able to put aside his politics and advocate the science. Go Johnny.
Go, Johnny, go! Go!
We've had 4 dead Markab in the past 3 days. Dr. Lazarin has certified them all death by natural causes. Nothing jumped out about them in a cursory autopsy, so I let it go. But I just finished a more detailed examination of the bodies. They were all killed by some kind of plague or infectious disease that...
Based on statistics by Johns Hopkins University, the global death rate of COVID-19 stands at 7%. The death toll is currently 300,000 and rising. Some people downplay COVID-19 by referring to media posts about underreported cases. Franklin shows us how deaths are underreported as well. He didn't notice the disease when he gave a cursory examination of the first 4 Markab deaths. It was only because they died in quick succession that he decided to do a more thorough autopsy. Deaths due to COVID-19 have also been underreported.
Now, statistically, this is way out of proportion.
Testing for COVID is only done if it's suspected to be a cause. At a time when the bodies pile up, there's only limited testing resources. From nursing homes to non-hospitalized cases and more, many COVID deaths remain unmerited. This was how California discovered that the first US death was 3 weeks earlier than first thought. This led to the realization that COVID-19 could have been spreading in the US in December, long before the international community realized it had spread beyond Wuhan. Whatever the true numbers, speculation without science is pointless. Hindsight is misleading when it comes to science. We only know the things we do because of the scientific process. We cannot ignore the scientific process for things that we think may be true but have no evidence. This path would almost always lead to misunderstanding. We can only wait as doctors and scientists continue to create a more accurate picture of the true extent of cases and deaths.
It is 100% terminal and 100% contagious.
It was the epidemiological study done by the Imperial College in London that changed the mind of the Conservative UK government. Listening to their scientists, the government went from lax recommendations to strong restrictions. This study showed that had COVID-19 been allowed to spread freely, the global death toll this year alone would have been 40 million, the same number of people who died in World War I. As bad as the current pandemic seems, the next one could be worse. It seems unthinkable that a disease could be 100% terminal and 100% contagious. Yet the Black Death came close. The Black Death was a plague pandemic that hit Europe in the Middle Ages, wiped out half the European population, and had a fatality rate of up to 100%. Caused by the bacteria Yersinia pestis, Black Death came in 3 forms, and if you got pneumonic or septicemic plague, death was the only outcome. If you had septicemic plague, there was even a chance you would die the same day you presented symptoms. The writer of Babylon 5, Micheal Straczinsky, based this episode on the Black Death, and far from being fiction, it seems plausible now that the Markab could have died within 24 hours of the first symptoms. What few realise is that this mythical disease is still with us today. The last major outbreak of the plague occurred 3 years ago in Madagascar. In fact, hundreds of cases are reported to the World Health Organization every year by countries all around the world, including the US and China. Scientific research has uncovered that the plague has been with us since the beginning of recorded history. The Black Death was one of the 3 plague pandemics that hit the world in the last 1,000 years, each killing tens of millions of people. Ancient texts mention the plague, including the oldest existing Hebrew Bible from the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Book of Samuel fragment, dated 25 BC, writes about how the Philistines developed the characteristic plague tumours. There's even evidence the plague caused a major decline of the human population in 3000 BC. Today, the plague can be cured with antibiotics. This reduces the death rate to 11% in Western countries. Unfortunately, this rate is still high compared to other vaccinated diseases. Should the plague ever become drug resistant, which has already happened once, it might devastate humanity once more. Personally speaking, when I found out the plague is still with us, it made me realize how fundamentally important the WHO is to us humans. WHO is our last best hope for survival against pandemics that could decimate the human race. With facts like these, I find it impossible to justify acts like cutting funding to the WHO. We are all in this together.
In all the work you've done, is there any indication as to whether or not the disease is infectious beyond your own species?
In a direct parallel to Babylon 5 that even Straczinsky probably had not anticipated, the issue of decimating other species is currently a major issue for the plague as well. In the US, mammals such as the black-tailed prairie dog and the black-footed ferret are under threat because Yersinia pestis is wiping them out. In non-human animals, this disease is known as sylvatic plague, but it's the same bacteria. The black-footed ferret is a native rodent of North America. For them, plague is 100% fatal. In order to save the species, a vaccine had to be developed. This new vaccine gives ferrets lifetime immunity and will hopefully stop the population decline. Across the world, there are over 200 species of mammals that can be infected by the plague. It mostly affects rodents, but it also affects cats and dogs. Cats are highly susceptible, with a third of those infected dying. The disease continues to be spread to people through contact with infected animals and from the fleas that come with them. There is the ever-constant threat the next outbreak of the plague will come again from interspecies transmission. For the coronavirus, that time is upon us once again. Back on Babylon 5, Franklin asks Lazarin the most important question uttered in this episode, and possibly even the show. Does it infect beyond your own species? Lazarin looks like his soul is crying as he understands the full weight of his ignorance on the subject.
I don't know, Stephen. May the gods forgive me. I do not know.
As it turned out, the Drafa Plague could jump species.
Now go, move.
But don't you understand what this means?
It means we have more information than we had 5 minutes ago.
Something this episode does very well is show the humanity of the medical workers. On one side you have the humanity of Franklin and the medical staff, and on the other you have the image of the hero, Dr. Lazarin. Franklin's worst fear is confirmed when he finds that the disease has jumped species, causing the death of a puckmara. His medical staff, however, don't want to autopsy the body for fear of catching it themselves. The medical staff don't want to put their lives on the line any more than anyone else, but continue working anyway. Dr. Franklin works himself to exhaustion, injecting stims to keep going. His anger and frustration rises throughout the episode as everything spirals out of his control, culminating in an outburst of rage toward his instrument trolley. Unfortunately, the reality of being a medical worker during a pandemic can create enormous stress. This was the unfortunate case of the manager of an emergency room. She worked at the Presbyterian Allen Hospital in New York, a location hit hard by the coronavirus. Seeing so many people die was a crushing experience which eventually led to Dr. Lorna Breen taking her own life. Dr. Lazarin represents the hero that many of us would like to see medical workers as. He maintained a calm composure throughout, even in the face of the complete annihilation of his own race. In the end, he willingly sacrifices himself to fight the Drafa Plague. He offers to do the autopsy, putting himself in direct contamination with the disease. He reasons that if he catches it, then Franklin can track the disease and hopefully gain insight into a cure.
Give me that much.
We dodged the bullet this time. What happens next time?
Knowing there will always be a next time, planning for a pandemic is a matter of life and death. It was surprising that Babylon 5 did not have a plan to tackle pandemics, but from previous episodes we'd already seen that EarthGov had been taken over by a callous government. Any programs that did not fit their agenda were being defunded, such as Babylon 5. So it's not surprising pandemic plans were missing. After all, we saw the same mistakes in the US. In fact, the US already had a pandemic plan, but it was never activated. History had taught the experts that each succeeding administration would be complacent. Then an outbreak would spur the government to action, only for them to lose steam a few years later, and for the next administration to forget those lessons entirely. This cycle of complacency had been running since at least the 1950s. It's astonishing to read about how, for example, George Bush created a pandemic plan that described a scenario in which a flu epidemic moves from a village in Asia to the United States, where it causes panic and as many as 1.9 million deaths. Or how Obama created the Global Health Security and Biodefense Unit, whose role was to bring coordination and leadership to the many scattered biodefense programs within the US government. Between the both of them, they had to deal with SARS, the modern world's biggest pandemic, AIDS, H1N1 or the swine flu, MERS, Ebola, and Zika. Yet at the same time, both incoming governments abolished the senior health position taken by Rear Admiral Kenneth Bernard, an epidemiologist. When they realized his position's importance after an outbreak, they would re-implement a health position again. Blind to this bipartisan complacency, the politicians and much of the media would continue to blame each other for cost-cutting. But going through budgets of organizations such as the CDC, USAID, and WHO paint a different picture. These organizations have record budgets that continue to go up yearly even in spite of presidential intentions for cutting budgets. $6 billion for the CDC, $27 billion for USAID, $4 billion for the WHO, and this still doesn't represent all the biodefense programs. In the end, pandemic resources in the US were many and varied. Previous outbreaks had been more or less well managed by how willing the president was to engage with those resources and the science. It is generally accepted, for example, that Obama's first outbreak, H1N1, was handled well.
There will be a surprise outbreak, and I hope by the end of my relatively short presentation you will understand why history, the history of the last 32 years that I've been the director of NIAID, will tell the next administration that there's no doubt in anyone's mind that they will be faced with the challenges that their predecessors were faced with.
Complacency is one thing, but what no one predicted was a future president with an extreme narcissistic personality. More than anything else, it was the president's narcissistic personality that stopped him from engaging in the science that could have contained COVID-19. The word narcissism is now overly used in everyday language, which has diluted its meaning, but within a more formal framework, narcissism is a specific set of extreme personality traits that can be highly dysfunctional to a person and the people around them. If that person is the leader of a country, the effects can be devastating. It's important to distinguish between narcissism as a disorder and narcissism as a personality. They are different. This is not a diagnosis, nor an attempt to peg a mental illness. People with mental illness need support, not stigmatization. Narcissism is an explanation for his personality, which brings with it a broader issue. His narcissistic traits are traits that we accept and encourage in our leaders. The question becomes, do we as a society want to continue encouraging narcissistic traits in our leaders? The US president has a clearly defined narcissistic personality, enabled by the political faction around him. Originally, all the media could do was talk about the president's individual outrageous actions without connecting them to the personality. They analysed his actions as if he were normal, but he is most definitely not normal. Ironically, it was probably this political incorrectness that got him elected in the first place. Gradually, the more in-depth media organisations have cottoned on to the patterns of his behaviour. The great irony here is that even though there were extraordinary amounts of money and expertise available, they couldn't stand against such destructive leadership. I could list specific problems of the government, but like much of the media, I would be in danger of missing the forest for the trees. Presidents have always reshuffled their staff, made budget recommendations, refocused their values, and dealt with outbreaks without needing monstrously sized pandemic plans. Ultimately, it wasn't the individual problems themselves, but the psychology of the current US president that stopped him from engaging in the science and the resources of the US government. The outrageous behaviours of the US president are all part of his narcissistic personality. Looking at just the coronavirus outbreak, we can see many of his narcissistic traits expressed. The need to feel more powerful than those around him, his emotional instability, the difficulty he has making stable relationships, only talking about himself. Criticism makes him feel like he's losing social status, so he lashes out. Denying everything, even when he's caught out, and blaming everyone else for everything. His distorted sense of reality, everyone walking on eggshells around him. Even the narcissistic phenomenon of having a zealously loyal following. Particularly damaging for a country, the tendency to split communities by exploiting differences. And the thing that exhausts everyone around them, the thing that makes people give in to the narcissist's demands, the narcissist never stops. There's never a break. It's perpetual and unrelenting, crashing the world around him from one crisis to another. The US president shows all these traits to extremes. And like a confused lover, the American people are caught in a relationship they don't understand, trying to cope, and before they can find the ground with their feet, reality is pulled out from underneath them again and again. This is what it feels like to be in a relationship with a person with narcissism. Narcissists are shocking when you first encounter them and you have no idea how to deal with them. It takes a long time to figure out first what's going on and then to create strategies for dealing with their personality. The thing about narcissists is they never change. You think they change, but they just learn how to speak words of redemption to get out of trouble and then go back to being themselves. They are never shamed into admitting fault. They will continue to be outrageous. Those who are against the president still have not learnt that, and still act surprised when he continues to be outrageous, as if by catching him out for the millionth time will somehow change something. Those who are for him don't realize that their needs are as expedient to him as everything else.
So what do you think President Trump should do to work on this area? So I think he probably needs to come into our communities and listen and find out exactly, talk to those families and find out what's really going on.
The president's supporter assumes he has the empathy to want to help. If the president did do something, it would only be because he saw their needs as stepping stones for more power. Ultimately, they too will suffer as he works against them in private to influence others who can offer him more. Is the chaos worth the political goal? So long as the president is in office, the same drama will repeat. He will always find another way to push the boundaries, and he will justify his actions, blurring the idea that he's done something wrong. Then he will push the boundaries again and again until events have spiraled into insanity, and there will never be a point where you can say normality led to insanity. This is the way narcissists work. The president's lack of empathy and need for self-image are so all-consuming that he will risk millions of lives in order to save his social standing. While people were dying and losing jobs and businesses, he talked at a coronavirus briefing about the cost he paid, the billions of dollars to become president. He refuses to wear face masks, saying it would send the wrong message. He wants to send the illusion that things are going back to normalcy to help his re-election. But paradoxically, he sends that message by not taking the necessary steps to actually make it happen. One of the more tragic examples of politics at play during a pandemic. Meanwhile, he continues to say many noteworthy things in briefings and on Twitter that make it seem like he is competent and knows what's going on. As a narcissist, he understands that these are the things he should be saying to influence others, but also like a narcissist, there's no connection to reality. He lacks the skills he boasts about having, and doesn't do the things he says he will. His words are his reality, they are his weapons. He didn't know how to deal with the pandemic, but characteristic for a person with a narcissistic personality, he refused to admit his lack of knowledge. Science does not care what people think, it objectively uncovers the way the world works. For the US president, science was his enemy because it didn't agree with his opinions, and threatened to show up his lack of understanding. He created a culture of fear around it, and fired those who advocated it. He not only ignored the science, he suppressed it. He refused to work with those who knew what to do, and instead helped spread misinformation, even misusing some of the pandemic preparations that were available. Mirroring the melodramatic life of a narcissist, this is the literal tale of the truth of science being a threat to the deepest psyche of a man who wants to reject reality. He's got windmills on the brain. Some would argue that the situation in America is not the fault of the president. They would argue that the current situation represents a deeper division within American society. However, given the narcissistic effect can be seen at a local level within the lives of people with narcissism, any analysis of the current situation must incorporate the president as a major factor. Positions of leadership within the White House were left vacant. There were extreme examples of cronyism as he rewarded those who yielded to his version of reality, a reality that placed his narcissistic needs at the center. Positions were replaced with family members or associates who had no expertise in the area and no place being there. He refuses to hear anything that doesn't fit into his version of the world. He wants to hear only good news. Everyone has to walk on eggshells around him. White House officials can only talk to him about the strategies he likes, while more important strategies are shunned. The desire to suppress the science flows down from the president to the officials who vie for his approval. The states were left with no unifying leadership. The pandemic programs had no unifying leadership because the Global Health Security and Biodefense Unit was dismantled in 2018, and the pandemic playbook left by Obama was left to gather dust. Now, the US, in spite of being one of the world's most advanced economies, is the epicenter of COVID-19, currently experiencing close to 2,000 deaths a day. Ignoring the science and the obvious risk, the president wants to start lifting lockdown restrictions already. The good news-only culture of the White House mirrors the Chinese Communist Party. The leadership of both countries suppress information they don't agree with, ultimately culminating in lost time that all but sign the death warrants of hundreds of thousands of people. The three governments of the US, China, and the Markab all played politics with pandemics and paid the price. Unfortunately, in the real world, that price spills over to the rest of the world as well.
They're in pain, frightened, dying. Minbaria taught that at such a time, the afflicted should be ministered to, comforted.
They're not your own people, Delenn.
I didn't know that similarity was required for the exercise of compassion.
Though this video was already too long, I had to include Delenn. In contrast to the fearful faith of Ambassador Fashar, Delenn's faith is built on compassion and love. She wanted to enter the quarantine zone despite the risk of infection in order to care for the sick. There, she helped a Markab child find its mother, only for the child to show signs of the Drafa Plague.
All life is transitory, a dream. We all come together in the same place at the end of time. If I don't see you again here, I will see you in a little while, in the place where no shadows fall.
For all intents and purposes, the Markab civilization has been destroyed.
It could be said that the Markab did indeed die of sin, the sin of pride. They believed they did not need help from outsiders. Had they sought help from Franklin, their race may have been saved. Instead, they let their fears take over and their politics overrule the science. But even though Franklin is the doctor we all need, and Sheridan is the leader we all want, writer Straczinsky doesn't let them win the day entirely. Straczinsky warns us that even with faith and good intent, sometimes the disease will still win. But failure doesn't invalidate competence any more than success validates incompetence. Exactly 100 years ago, humans died by the millions from the Spanish flu. 100 years later, we're reliving the same scenario. Will we ever learn from our histories and from the stories that we tell ourselves? Or are we doomed to repeat our mistakes again and again? Sheridan asks the question, what happens next time? We're left with two choices, Franklin's cynicism that things never change, or Delen's optimism that we can make a better future. I know which one I want to happen, so I'll leave Delen's answer to finish off this video.
What happens? What happens is that we honor the memory of those who are no longer with us by using what we have learned to save others, to exercise faith and patience and charity, to reach out to those who are afraid. If we can do that, then their passing will have had meaning, and we will grow from it.
Maybe. I hope so.
Da 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 da.